the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, Professor Mamphela Ramphele, our two very special guests today, Professor Solomon Bennett, Emeritus Professor of Medicine and previous Chair of the Department of Medicine at the University of Cape Town. In fact, the fifth chair who held that post from 1980 to 1989, and latterly a adjunct professor at the Dalalana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And our other very special guest, and the reason we are all gathered here today, Emeritus Professor Stuart Saunders, who was the fourth chair of the Department of Medicine between 1970 and 1980. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a wonderful honor for me to welcome you to this second annual Dr. Stuart John Saunders Lecture. I particularly wish to welcome the family of Professor Benatar, his wife Evelyn, who is in the audience, and his two sons, David and Brian. I hope they have arrived by now. Welcome to you. It's also a special pleasure for me to see so many of my teachers and their teachers and their teachers in the audience. And it's a wonderful reunion for all of us. Now, this lecture is made possible through a very generous bequest to the Department of Medicine and the University of Cape Town by the late Anita Johanna Saunders, who was the late wife of Professor Saunders. And you might ask yourself, why, besides the love of the man, would she want the university to remember his contributions to the life of this institution? I wish to just share with you three of those reasons. She had indicated that she wanted the lecture to be in remembrance of his scholarship and his contributions to the university as a chair of medicine and as a vice chancellor. As chair of medicine, Professor Stuart Saunders was the first to accept non-white registrars into the training program, allowing us to have a non-segregated training platform in this university. And as a vice chancellor, Professor Saunders was the first to allow the student residencies to admit students of all races. And during his tenure as vice chancellor, he set up a special fund to ensure the protection of academic freedom in this university. And for these seminal contributions, which endure to this day, he has been recognized on a number of platforms, including being a recipient of the Order of Baobab in this country. Now, if you were paying attention, you will note that the speaker tonight followed Professor Saunders' tenure as chair of medicine. And I can think of no better person to deliver this year's lecture than Professor Benatar, who's going to speak to us on health, healthcare, and professionalism in the 21st century. The order of proceedings tonight is that I will chair the program, which is fitting as the chair of medicine. And I will invite the Vice Chancellor to say a little bit more about the lecture itself, as well as to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. We'll then invite Professor Benatar to make his remarks, and I will be happy to take a few questions from the audience afterwards. VC.
Thank you very much, Tuntoweko, Professor Ntusi, for the wonderful welcome. It's really a wonderful event, just by looking at who's in the room. And before we walked into the lecture hall, I went to a few people to greet them. And of course, occasionally when I host alumni and people who've graduated from the university many years ago, I'm fascinated by the fact that you meet graduates from this university who perhaps graduated in I think the oldest one graduated in 1956 or something. And it's great, and talking about what was happening then. And today, my question was, are you connected to Professor Saunders or to Professor Benatar? And my second question was, what's the connection? Were you a student? Were you a colleague on campus? Did you work for them? Did you work with them? Did you, because there's many connections. And it is clear in the room that there are people who were students of students, and some people who can't even remember how they're connected to any of you. All they know is that they've known you for more than 40 years. And so it feels like a reunion, a wonderful reunion to be here, to honor Professor Saunders, but also to have Professor Benatar giving the lecture. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Dumelang, Sanbonani, Molweni, thank you so much for joining us. I want to reflect on what it means for the University of Cape Town to host the Stuart Saunders Lecture. This lecture is an opportunity for us as a community to recognize the lasting impact Dr. Saunders has had on UCT as a professor of medicine from 1971 to 1980, when he headed the Department of Medicine and founded the Liver Research Group, but also as Vice Chancellor from 1981 to 1996, and after that, as a loyal friend of UCT. In each role, he served with a level of distinction that earned him honorary degrees from universities of Aberdeen, Sheffield, Rhodes, UCT, Princeton, Toronto, and most recently, Wits University, where in fact I had the honor of hooding him in 2014. Another former UCT Vice Chancellor, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele, describes how when Dr. Saunders led UCT, he pushed, and I quote, he pushed the boundaries of an apartheid state to create space for higher education to rise to its responsibility. I have seen Professor Saunders create this kind of space. I've only known him very briefly because I'm fairly new to Cape Town and UCT. But I've seen him sort of do this, create this kind of space for people like myself. And I want to tell you a little story. In 2017, it was my first year to serve as Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research and Internationalization here at UCT. And at some stage during that year, towards the end of that year, academics got very upset and very concerned about after a member of the executive had invited a controversial speaker on campus to speak about decolonizing science. So when I took over as VC, the issue kept brewing and growing, and more people were getting angry. And then I got appointed as VC, the issue kept brewing. And the previous VC briefed me and said, the College of Fellows are really upset about this matter. We've got to talk about it at some stage. And so when I took over as VC, and the matter was still brewing, and the College of Fellows wanted to discuss the matter, my first meeting at the College of Fellows, which of course Professor Saunders is also a fellow, I said to them, it doesn't help to talk about the person who was invited. Let's rather talk about the issues. Let's not give the person mileage. Let's talk about their issue, because that's what's important, And in fact, whether the person was invited or not, the issue remains for the elders of the university to discuss. So we agreed to have a session on decolonization during one of the meetings of the College of Fellows. And I think everyone was worried, what's going to happen at that meeting? And 2 senior academics in the Faculty of Science offered to share their views on the origins and workings of scientific knowledge. I myself was worried and scared. I remember that was my second meeting that I was chairing as chair of the College of Fellows, because that's the role of the VC. And I started that session by saying, I am very worried. I hope it goes well. I want you to know that this is not you against me. We're discussing the issue. And I was thankful that 2 of those professors agreed to lead the discussion. Dr. Solomon Bennett came to the meeting. And along with many others, it was a very well-attended College of Fellows meeting. Prof. Saunders had heard about the discussion that we were going to have at the meeting and emailed me beforehand to ask why he had not received an invitation and wanted to attend the meeting. Initially, I thought, wow, former Vice-Chancellor, I should just accede and let Stuart come because I got the message before I came. But then I looked at the terms of reference and had the uncomfortable duty thereafter to inform him that according to the terms of reference, he did not qualify to attend the meeting. The meetings of the College of Fellows are open only to members, those fellows who are currently permanently employed by the university, and fellows who have been appointed as senior scholars. As Professor Saunders is retired, he is a life fellow, and as such, doesn't qualify to attend meetings of the college. So I wrote to Professor Saunders to explain, and he was amazingly gracious. When I wrote it, I mean, I had met Professor Saunders after I got appointed. I asked for lunch with him to discuss the job and to get some wisdom. I hadn't met with him many times, and so I was worried. I thought he was going to write me a long letter telling me where to get off. But he wrote back to apologize. His graciousness in this situation illustrates how Professor Saunders leads. He will push, and I quote, the boundaries of an apartheid state, close quote. But he doesn't push people. Instead, he creates space for them to grow. In that spirit, UCT founded this lecture in his name as a way to create space for higher education to rise to its responsibility of academic discussion and debate, specifically in the health sciences. This evening's lecture by Professor Benatar focuses on the future of healthcare, a topic of particular interest. With the arrival of the 4th Industrial Revolution, not to mention the advent of the National Health Insurance, UCT is thinking deeply about how we can navigate the coming changes to meet the needs of all South Africans, to turn the tide on poverty and inequality. So it is appropriate that we get to hear from Professor Solomon Bennett today. He is Emeritus Professor of Medicine at UCT. He headed the Department of Medicine and was Chief Physician at Groote Schuur Hospital from 1980 to 1999. He founded the UCT Center for Bioethics in 1992 and directed it until 2012. His many professional positions include serving as president of the International Association of Bioethics from 2001 to 2003, and lecturing around the world in medical schools, including University of Toronto Medical School, where he has taught a module on international research ethics every year since 2000. He is an elected foreign member of the US National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of London, the Hastings Center in New York, and the Faculty of Medicine at Imperial College London. His research focuses on cross-cultural considerations in international research ethics, ethics in public health and planetary health, South Africa's health services, and professionalism and human rights. We are very lucky as a university to have such elders in our midst. as Professor Solomon Benatar, and we look forward to his lecture. I hand over to you, Professor Benatar.
I'd like to invite Soli to come up and deliver this year's annual Dr. Stuart Saunders lecture.
Thank you very much, Ntobeko and Vice Chancellor, for introducing the evening and introducing me and welcoming Dr. Saunders. It's a very special honor and a very special pleasure for me to give this lecture in honor of Stuart Saunders, because the relationship that we've had over 55 years extends over many different capacities. I first met him when I was an intern in his firm on the 1st of January 1966. And since then, we've been related in many different ways, including my being the sub-warden at Copelan residence when he was the warden there, family, friends, a registrar in the Department of Medicine, a consultant, subsequently the head of the Department of Medicine, and also with Stuart working in the department part-time while he was Vice Chancellor. I've had many links with many members of his family, not least with Anita, who I remember with enormous amount of affection for endowing this lecture in Stuart's name. A striking thing about the relationship between Stuart and I from that very junior time when I was an intern right through to now is that I don't think we've ever exchanged a harsh word. We've certainly argued, we've disagreed on issues, we've agreed to disagree on issues, but we've never had any harsh words or any altercation of any kind. It's been a very cordial and friendly relationship. It's 60 years since I came to UCT, and I was educated and practiced in a unique period during the history of medicine when so many developments were taking place, many of which we've all benefited from in this audience. For the first 40 years of my career, I was focused entirely on clinical medicine, the care of individual patients, teaching of students, and then subsequently some administration. When I was appointed the head of the Department of Medicine in 1980, it was at a difficult time in South Africa's history. Many of the more senior colleagues and myself who would have been appointed instead of me had left the country, and the challenge to rebuild the Department of Medicine was enormous. In thinking through the challenges at that time, I chose to entitle my inaugural lecture, Changes, Challenges, and Choices in Medicine. And in many ways, I could have renamed this lecture in the same way, because that's what I'm going to talk about, but in a different guise. Facing the changes in South Africa and beginning to understand how they developed and what their history was and the pathophysiology, I increasingly began to see South Africa as a microcosm of the world, and the disparities in our society as representing issues in many other parts of the world. And so that led me into a much broader and more integrated understanding of population and global health changes. And I'm enormously grateful to the University of Toronto for inviting me to teach and supporting my time in Toronto every year for 19 years, and in particular over the last 12 years since I retired formally. Now, there have been a certain number of themes which have run through what I've been interested in over the past 20 years or so, separate from but not unrelated to my interests in biomedical, clinical and research interests. The first was disparities, the problem of disparities. The second was the structure and the function of systems. How do systems operate, and how do they influence the way individuals behave? The third was the pace and the nature of change at the local, the global, and the planetary level, with an emphasis on the longue durée, the changes that take place over long periods of time that are less easy to understand than those which take place over short periods of time. The fourth aspect of interest to me was ethics in medicine, the theoretical aspects and the clinical application. The next was social values, what it meant to be a health professional, what the role and responsibility of a health professional was in our society and indeed in any society. And finally, the topic of my lecture today is the kind of world that we live in today and the challenges that this poses when the future is so very threatened. I want to suggest to you that our world in the 21st century, in the early 21st century, comprises a very complex set of interlinked, deep structural crises that form part of what has been called a global or planetary organic crisis. Organic because they're all linked. a combination of multi-dimensional inequalities and antagonisms, environmental degradation, and climate change. Sorry, we should go back. Shouldn't be there. Okay. Driven by patterns of wasteful and often frivolous consumerism that are threatening the future life prospects for billions of people. Within a political order and what has been called a market civilization, in which considerations of economic growth and profit have eclipsed the common good. And I remind you, for those of you who might have read about this, the books that John Kenneth Galbraith wrote in the 1950s and 1960s on the affluent society and the good society, where he predicted the kind of trajectory that his own country, Canada and America, would follow down the line if they continued to operate in the way they were operating at that time. So the complex crisis that I'm referring to today contributes to escalating humanitarian distress and raises many questions. For example, what is our role as humans in relationship to each other, locally and globally, and our relationship to nature? What is the basis for our moral values and the extent to which we are true to these? And how do we deal with different ways of seeing, living, and cooperating in the world in which we live? Because there are so many different ways of doing that. Excuse me. My intention today is to try to provide a very broad perspective on local and global disparities in wealth and health and their causes to facilitate our addressing local health challenges and the potential fatal diagnosis of planetary entropy. My lecture is globally focused, but is relevant to South Africa, both to the general life in the country, to medical education and to practice, and to the NHI specifically. Many people have said to me that when I give a presentation like this, I'm speaking as though I was in a satellite, looking down from afar on the globe and seeing the big picture and missing some of the detail. That may be the case, although I hope I will include both. I'm very privileged to have one foot in Africa, one foot in North America with my work in Canada, because this gives me the opportunity not only to see both societies from different perspectives, but also to mix with colleagues, brilliant colleagues, with whom I've had the opportunity to think and read and write and teach, and to develop a better understanding of myself and our world. So what I want to do today is I want to speak about 5 things. I want to talk about the contested state of health globally. I want to talk about global instability and the impact on health. I want to speak a little bit about the reform of healthcare over the past 40 years, including where South Africa lies in relationship to that. And then what the implications are for health, healthcare services, medical education, and professionalism. And finally, I'll conclude with some very brief suggestions for pathways into the future, which is what the debate really should be about. Okay, so in 2013, a paper appeared in The Lancet entitled Global Health 2035, A World Converging Within a Generation. There'd been so many advances in health that the optimists like Dean Jamieson and others felt that the gaps were going to be narrowed and health would be pretty well equal all around the world. And this, of course, made a big impression because there had indeed been many advances in healthcare. And 2 recent books, one by Steven Pinker and one by Hans Rosling, both packed with facts regarding how the world has improved and how life has improved and how the way we behave as human beings has improved, made a startling impression on those of us in particular who've benefited from those advances. So these are some of the improvements that they've listed, and I won't spell them all out, but deaths under 5 years, the maternal mortality rate per 100,000 live births, and you'll see the reductions between 1990 and the 2020s, the number of malaria deaths, the number suffering from hunger, severe poverty under $2 a day, from 2 billion people to 1 billion people. And I should just dwell on that for a moment, because these figures hide something that the figures don't tell you about. To be lifted out of poverty, you only have to rise from a daily per capita income of $1.8 a day to $2.1 or $2.2 a day. And calling that lifting people out of poverty and calling eradication of poverty, having nobody living at below $2, but having a whole bunch living at 2.1, is an illusion which makes people feel we're doing extraordinarily well. HIV persons on treatment. In 2000, only 685,000 people were receiving antiretroviral therapy. by 2017, 21.7 million were receiving treatment. But that was 21 million out of 38 million who are HIV positive, so a large proportion of patients still not receiving treatment. Annual related deaths from AIDS had diminished. The Global Fund from TB was very proud of the fact that they'd spent $42 billion on HIV, TB, and malaria. $42 billion is minuscule in relationship to what the requirements were. There were major reductions in deaths from cardiovascular disease, and Bernie Gersh told you about that last year in the Stuart Saunders lecture. Longer survival of many with malignancies on new treatment, and there are in the audience people who benefited from those new treatments, which are wonderful advances. And then there are numerous new diagnostics and therapeutics that many of you know about, and the promise of artificial intelligence and big data and the impact that that's going to make on health. There's recently been an announcement from the University of Toronto of a $100 million donation purely to build an infrastructure for pursuing issues in artificial intelligence and big data. So this is exciting, enormous interest. Now I want to show you this slide from Hans Rosling, because Hans Rosling has a wonderful reputation all over the world. And his book, Factfulness, that I showed you earlier, was completed by his family after he died, as he died before he was able to complete that. And I want to show you a couple of things on this graph. On the bottom, you see the income from poor to rich, and it's the income per capita per year. And on the left-hand side, you'll see something like $1,000 per person per year. And on the right-hand side, you'll see over $128,000 per person per year. And the size of the circles represents the size of the countries in terms of population and where they're located in relationship to health in terms of life expectancy and income. So, for example, you'll see that India is a sort of middle income country, and China, and their longevity is good. South Africa, down there, is richer than many other countries, but life expectancy is much lower. You'll see that there's a linear relationship here. The wealthier people are, the longer they live. And you'll also see the regions. The regions are on that map. Africa's in blue, and you'll see that Africa's down at the lower end. Another point I want to draw your attention to here is the fact that at any given level of income, there's a very wide range of life expectancy. So health can vary enormously. It's not only related to wealth, and it's certainly not only related to expenditure on healthcare. It relates to many other factors that I will mention today. Now, what I'd like to do today is to go to one of Hans Rosling's very famous slides and show you the change that has taken place, which you'll be enormously impressed with. And this is starting in 1800s, and this is the various countries that you saw before. And we're going down the line, and you're seeing increasing life expectancy, and you're seeing increasing wealth, and it keeps going. Okay, well, if that's not impressive, what is it? No wonder that Hans Rosling has a major reputation for having shown the wonderful improvements that take place, and Steven Pinker and his great big tome has supported that too. The problem is that there are some critiques of this, and Hans Rosling's work has been critiqued on the following grounds. The first, that he's used a highly biased samples of statistics. The second, that he's failed to analyze upward negative trends. For example, he hasn't analyzed the ecological consequences of ongoing population growth. He hasn't looked at the consumptive trends exceeding planetary boundaries, and he hasn't looked at the question of migration and the migratory flows. A major defect is his central assumption that the economic growth will continue to spread globally during the 21st century. He's published very few articles, and his work is not peer-reviewed largely, and those who've critiqued his work have described him more as an edutainer than someone who's got all the facts right. So what I want to move to is the other side of the story, because these are some of the issues that are of concern to all of us. And they are, first of all, the persisting disparities. Look at the life expectancy at birth. It ranges from over 80 years to 50 years. Under 5 mortality from less than 5 per 1,000 live births per year in Canada to over 137 in Sierra Leone. Maternal mortality also, a wide range. Ongoing deaths from malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV that perhaps we shouldn't be seeing today. Annual per capita health expenditure that ranges from less than $50 per person per year to over $10,000 per person per year. And 90% of global medical research expenditures on 10% of the global burden of disease. As I've alluded to, poverty alleviation is inadequate and hypocritical, and the social determinants of health are underplayed. I want to show you some of these things in graphic form, because the devil lies in the detail. So in this graph, for example, and I'm going to go over these graphs pretty quickly. In this graph, you'll see that longevity has improved everywhere, from the more developed countries right down to Africa. But it's like a parallel increase. The gap remains wide, and Africa's at the bottom. There's also big differences within countries. Within the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, there's a 10-year life expectancy difference between the indigenous population and the rest of the population. If we look at deaths by region for children under the age of 5, everybody's very proud of the fact that deaths under 5 have diminished, but look at the fact of what's happened in Africa at the bottom and in South Asia, much less reduction. So there's massive death rates still under the age of 5, and the total reduction is not all that much to be celebrated given those residual facts. If you look at that graph of maternal mortality, where women die in association with pregnancy, the darkest colors are the highest mortality rate, and 88% of all maternal deaths take place in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, with the highest being in sub-Saharan Africa, 546 per 100,000 per year. And if you look at some maps like this that portray the burden of disease as the size of the country, you'll see which countries are carrying the burdens, for example, of deaths from pregnancy, perinatal deaths, low birth weights, and all nutritional deficiencies. So that shows the global distribution of the burden of disease. Global malaria deaths, a significant reduction in malaria deaths, but the blue is Africa. So most of the deaths from malaria still take place in Africa, and it's an enormous death rate from malaria. And if you look at the fact that there's multi-drug resistant parasites spreading across Southeast Asia, and imagine what that might do if it were to come to Africa, you can see that malaria remains a major problem that we need to address. Tuberculosis, similarly, that's how the world looks like in terms of the burden of disease in relationship to tuberculosis. In 1995, I think it was, yes, I wrote a paper entitled Prospects for Global Health, Lessons from Tuberculosis. And the point of that paper was to say we had short course chemotherapy for TB at the cost of $1 per year of life saved. And I predicted that if we didn't do that at a global level, that we would face in the future multi-drug resistant tuberculosis that might become so expensive to treat that it was untreatable. Well, in South Africa, 2.2% of our TB cases are multi-drug resistant, but they consume 32% of the TB budget. So the expense of those drugs is enormous, and the problem of multi-drug resistance could get worse. Multi-drug resistance for HIV, multi-drug resistance for malaria are major problems to deal with, and they won't be solved merely with finding new drugs. Those diseases are much more complex and socially based. Here's HIV/AIDS prevalence, and the bottom slide shows you where doctors are working. And you'll see that the number of doctors in Africa where the burden of AIDS is very small, which tells us that we can't rely on doctors to treat all patients with AIDS. We have to be much more imaginative. We have to do something different. We have to use community health workers, primary healthcare doctors, nursing assistants, midwives, whatever we can use to treat it, because there will never be enough doctors. What about hunger? Hunger in the world has reduced. People always say, well, we've reduced hunger in the world. But look where it's been reduced. In China and in India, not in South Asia, and not in sub-Saharan Africa, where it might have got worse. And if we look at the Mekong River, which is the lifeblood of Southeast Asia, that is at its lowest level in 100 years. It's heavily dammed and controlled by China, and the food supply of South Asia is in jeopardy. So whether hunger will continue to be alleviated or not remains in doubt. I want to turn to Africa very briefly, and I want to refer you to this book. It's a short book written by Gerald Kaplan from Toronto, who's a journalist and an investigative journalist, who's written about the betrayal of Africa under those titles there. He points out what a diverse continent it is, how it would be simplistic just to label it as just Africa, but it has a common predicament that all African countries are dealing with. He makes the point that history matters, and he shows the map of Africa on the left, which was the empires and civilizations of Africa that existed up to about 1500. And the second map shows the carving up of Africa by the colonial powers and what Africa looked like at that time, with all the implications that he spells out in some detail. He also talks about the Great Conspiracy. The Great Conspiracy is the continuing extraction of resources from Africa by external forces, but usually in collusion with powerful, tyrannical, kleptocratic leaders. And without that colluding together, the resources could not have been extracted so easily from this very wealthy continent. That graph shows you that $1 trillion have been removed from Africa due to illicit financial flows over a 50-year period. And during that same time, about $1 trillion has also been given to Africa in terms of financial aid. 2 points I want to make there, and that is that financial aid of $1 trillion doesn't translate into $1 trillion where it hits Africa. Much of that, up to 80%, is spent on the people who donate the money, working to make the plans and to bring the aid here, and a lot gets stripped off by the wealthy at the top in those countries, so it translates into a very small amount of aid.
So a great deal of good is indeed done with development aid, but not as much as intended.
And if $1 trillion sounds a lot to you, and that's $1 trillion of financial aid over 50 years, just remember that when the banks collapsed in 2008, $17 trillion were found in 3 months to bail out the banks. So development aid, it's worthy of a lecture itself in terms of what it does, of course. Now, that's the background. That's the background that I've given you of the facts of health today. And I want to tell you something about global instability and the impact on health. Because we're not living in a world where there's a linear projection into the future of improvements, as I've suggested, but it's much more complicated than that. So the crisis is a multifactorial crisis. The economic crisis is one of the wide disparities in wealth and health that I mentioned, but more recently recognized even by the most conforming economists, is that the economic system is not only unstable, but it's fraudulent and it's corrupt. Again, to refer to Kenneth Galbraith, he wrote a marvelous book a few years ago entitled
The Economics of Innocent Fraud.
The fraud was often perpetuated by people who innocently operated within the economic system. Then there's the biological crisis, the infectious diseases and antibiotic resistance, and the fact that many epidemics have occurred over recent years, be tracked by the WHO Health Organization, and the fear of bioterrorism that exists in the world. A sociological crisis that I'll mention a bit more about in a moment, and the environment and ecological crisis, and we're exceeding the planetary capacity in terms of our consumption patterns. All of those threaten human health and security, and all are linked to the global political economy. Now, here's the graph again from Rosling. And one asks oneself, with these kinds of disparities, how could one imagine for a moment that means that the projection into the future is getting better? I've pointed out where South Africa is. I've pointed out the vast difference between the various countries and the size of those populations. And of course, the problem relates both to the size of populations and the consumption patterns. This is how the distribution of resources has changed over the years. The BMJ published this champagne glass of poverty in 1999, which reflected the distribution of global income in about 1992. And that was about $30 trillion global GDP at that time. And you can see that
The richest 20% and second richest 20%.
was where the majority of the wealth lay. Well, this is what it looked like in 2007. The global GDP had doubled, and the increase in wealth had all gone to the top. And the gap between the top and the bottom had grown enormously. So the trickle-down effect that the conventional economists had described didn't happen. In fact, it was a squeezed-up effect. The resources were squeezed right up to the top. It's interesting that Oxfam, in its latest report last year, pointed out that 26 billionaires own as much as 50%, 3.5 billion people in the world. Now, this shows you Mumbai, and it shows you the poverty close to wealth. And the point I want to make with this slide is that it's not only absolute wealth that counts, it's relative wealth too. The relative gap, even in countries of similar overall economic level, the wider the gap between the top and the bottom, the more frequently one comes across these problems. Life expectancy falls, infant mortality rises, homicides are greater, greater imprisonment. All of these are worse in any society that's more unequal. So it's a question of absolute wealth and a question of relative wealth. This just shows you something on the biological crisis. It shows you the emerging infectious diseases that have spread since 1997. Many of these are spread from animals to humans. They've arisen because of the close conditions in which people live under very impoverished circumstances to animals, and allows the spread of organisms from animals to humans. So that's a major challenge for the future. The sociological crisis relates to geopolitical power balances, the reciprocal devaluation of lives, where some lives just don't seem to matter. And in treating people in that way, one wonders what they think of those who don't place any value on their lives. The anger, the violence, the organized crime and terrorism we see is in part, I won't say entirely, related to this. There has been, as you know, erosion of democracy, having been on the upswing, democracies on the downswing, and that's a major problem. And war and cyber attacks are still on the horizon. Cyber war, according to some who are writing about it today, is about at the stage where we were when Orville and Wilbur Wright first invented the aeroplane. There's a long way to go before we see what the impact of cyber attacks might be. But displaced persons is going to be another big problem. I'll explain why. At the moment, there are just over 71 million displaced persons. And the United Nations projection is a minimum of 200 million by 2050, with a high-end prediction of 1 billion. And those are predictions one doesn't know where they'll be. But this again shows you where those displaced people are. The top graph shows it in terms of circles, the size of the displaced numbers of people in the regions, and the bottom shows you the shape of the world in terms of the countries that harbor the major displaced people. And that just gives you an idea at the human level of what it means to be displaced and to be fleeing from one's home and trying to find somewhere else to live that may be a little better. Now, for the ecological crisis, I just want to briefly mention these. I'm not going to go into them. Climate change we know about. Land degradation is enormous and has a tremendous adverse potential for food security. Water insecurity too, and we know about that in Cape Town. We've experienced it ourselves for many of those reasons. And then, of course, there's deforestation, extinction of species, pollution of the seas and lakes, air pollution. And pollution is a central issue. The pollution with plastics, the pollution of air, all of those are major issues with major health implications. And all of them are related to the use of energy and consumption patterns, which I've indicated earlier, are often frivolous. We create goods just for the sake of consuming them. Many of them can have to be replaced within a few years. They don't last very long. So we're a consumer society where consume today and forget about tomorrow seems to be the motto. So everybody's impressed with economic growth. And economic growth is great, but economic growth is going to the wrong place and it may be depleting the future. This shows you the exponential growth of population very briefly. And this shows you the exponential use of energy. And that exponential use of energy, you'll see from the top writing there, is that in the 20th century, 10 times more energy was used than in the previous 1,000 years. And that, of course, has given rise to increasing temperatures, which you see on the bottom right-hand corner. The metaphor that I used earlier of planetary entropy, I think that this, in a sense, spells a potentially bad future if we don't take the advice that have been given with regard to what needs to be done. And I want to draw the analogy with a lung tumor. If you look at tumors of the lung, and I'm quoting a particular variety which has a doubling time of 100 days, it takes 9 years to go from one malignant cell to the size that you can first see it on the chest X-ray, right at the very bottom, 1 centimeter in diameter. And another 10 doublings, and it's a kilogram in size, and the patient's dead. So that's exponential growth. We're proud of economic growth, but we don't like the growth of tumors. But the growth has similar implications. Excessive growth can be extraordinarily harmful. This shows you the ecological footprint. And at the bottom, you'll see the United States. At the top, the biggest circle, you'll see China. The purple colors at the top are Africa, South Africa. This is the distribution of the ecological footprint according to the deciles of income. And you'll see that, again, the top 10% of earners in the world produce 49% of the CO2 in the world, and the bottom 50% of people produce 10% of the CO2. So it's a question of population growth, but it's also a question of consumption patterns. And whenever I hear people saying we need less population growth, I say we also need less consumption, because those who are consuming at the top are doing an enormous amount of harm. Now, if we were to all live like people in America live, top of the graph there, we would need 5 planets. So the American dream is in fact a global nightmare. And those who aspire to live like America at the total level don't understand that they're living on the future. And we've all heard recently about South Africa's government debt to GDP ratio of 60% or thereabouts. Well, look at the map on the right, and the dark brown colors are the debt to GDP ratios of other countries, and you'll see that North America is over 100%. So some of the wealthiest countries are in enormous debt, which means that they're living on the future. The quality of life that many enjoy is at the cost of future generations. Now, this graph shows you the areas of the world where climate change is going to have the greatest impact. It's those dark blue areas in coastal areas. And that circle that you see there comprises where half the world's population lives. So half the world's population live within a circle, and many more live on the east coast of Africa, where the damages are going to be enormous, and the migration from those areas could be enormous in addition to the deaths that occur. This shows you the flood deaths that have taken place between 2001 and 2017. And the next slide shows you the heat wave deaths that have taken place. And so far, the death rate from climate change is spread across the world in that particular way. Well, the CO2 is produced in one place, the trend for climate change is produced in one place and one group of people, and a different group of people are suffering. And this shows you the concept of a state shift in the Earth's biosphere. If you look at the circles at the top, the green part of the circles is the percentage of the Earth's terrestrial ecosystem that's beginning to show an abnormality in its state, which is becoming non-resilient and can potentially shift into a totally unstable state. And the prediction is
that in 2045, unless we take action,
there'll be a transition to a position of no return in terms of damage to our environment. This shows a picture from the Guardian recently that the Amazon rainforest is close to that tipping point. So what about the health impact? What sort of health impact will those changes have? Let me just tell you about some of those. First of all, there'll be a changing rate of illness and disease, as well as deteriorating living conditions from exposure to thermal extremes, and I've showed you some of that. There'll be geographical changes in vector ecology, and hence locations of infectious diseases. Infectious diseases that were common in the global south will become much more common in the global north. There'll be the emergence of many new infectious diseases. Adverse effects on child growth and development from changing food production and distribution. More malignancies and more post-traumatic stress syndrome. It would seem that the difficulties of the world in which we live is giving rise to an enormous amount of mental illness at every level, as I'll mention a little later, even to the healthcare professionals in the USA. And the growing burden of debilitating chronic respiratory diseases that not even wealthy countries will be able to afford. So let me turn to the next subject, because it's against that background that reform of healthcare has been taking place over the last 40 years. Many countries around the world have been attempting to reform their healthcare systems, as we would like to do to ours today. The reform of healthcare has taken place across a dialectic of two sets of values. The one set of values is health for all, with health being something of social value. In that situation, risk is socialized, and there's universalization of equitable access to healthcare. The ideas behind the Alma Ata Declaration. The other end of the dialectic is healthcare as a commodity, of political and economic value. And over the last 40 years, under the neoliberal capitalist dominance and a market civilization, that idea has tended to dominate, so that even all the countries that have so far and in the past developed national health services of one kind or another, or national health insurances, have suffered under the load of the commodification challenge. The emphasis in a market civilization is on individualism, on consumerism, on competitiveness, and on profit. And this has given rise to what's been called the medical industrial complex, a term coined by Arnold Relman, who was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine many years ago, and also to the academic industrial complex, whereby universities are increasingly tuned in to doing what industry wants them to do and to produce the kinds of jobs that industry demands, rather than pursuing knowledge with the freedom and the opportunities that universities are really about. This is essentially an ideological and a political struggle. And that struggle, through the neoliberal economic policies, has, in the views of many, destroyed the historic compromise of the post-World War period, when Europe and America were being rebuilt in the wake of that war and in the wake of the Great Depression. This has been driven by business interests that have transformed the state, promoted the market, weakened the provision of basic needs, and undermined the social solidarity that lies behind the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All of those ideas were spelt out in quite some detail in a paper that I was privileged to write together with the late David Saunders from the University of the Western Cape, and my colleague Stephen Gill,
Who is a global political economist from York University in Toronto.
and published in the Oxford Handbook of Global Health Politics. That global handbook has a rich series of many, many chapters on these issues, and in our chapter we briefly outline these forces changing healthcare reform. Now I want to show you this graph because I think it's interesting, and let me dwell on it for a moment. I want you just to focus on the red line. The red line is the historical marginal tax rate. Forget about the blue line at the bottom, just look at the top. And if you look at the point between 1920 and 1940, just after the Great Depression, the recovery, the New Deal, and the recovery from that required increasing the marginal tax rates. And you'll see how high they went. They went to over 90%. That was under the Keynesian economic policies. In the 1980s, when the neoliberal policies were introduced, they were introduced because everyone, or the people concerned, were concerned with economic growth, that economic growth was not taking place adequately. Well, you'll see that economic growth did take place. It grew from 2 trillion in the 1920s up to 7 trillion. But with the introduction of the neoliberal trading mechanism and the freedom of trade, the economy grew enormously up to over $80 trillion in the current period. That little line that you'll see there is the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is the measurement of the disparities between the bottom and the top. So the economic growth took place, as I've shown you on those champagne glasses, going mainly to the top with very little down at the bottom. So it's important to understand that the national health insurances in America, in Canada, in Europe, even the medical aids and Medicare in America were built at a time when there was a redistribution of income. And since that time, when that redistribution is no longer taking place, the disparities have widened. We just need to turn briefly to the determinants of health. What makes us healthy or what makes us sick? Everyone tends to focus just on medical services. And of course, medical services are important, and I'd be the first to attest to that. I've been the beneficiary of many medical advances during the course of my life, having had a chronic illness since my early teens. And without that, and without the wonderful care provided by many of my colleagues, some of whom are in this audience, I wouldn't be here to speak to you today. So the advances have been tremendous, and medical care makes a vast difference to the life of individual people. But at the population level, the most important factors are the social factors that I've outlined there, and the societal influences that relate to the political economy and particular belief systems. This gives you an example of the social determinants of health. This is a curve showing the reduction in mortality rate from tuberculosis. And right at the top is before the tubercle bacillus had even been identified by Koch. And the mortality rate fell because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the improved living conditions, because of the isolation of patients in sanatoria of various kinds. And you'll see when streptomycin was introduced, the death rate fell further. And of course, with treatment today, one can make a major difference to the outcome of tuberculosis in any given patient. But the social factors were critically important in reducing the mortality from TB. And this is just a snapshot of the world to show you about the impact of air pollution. Air pollution is greatest in India and in China, where less than 1% of the population are breathing in air at World Health Organization standards. And in 2015, air pollution killed 7 million people, which was 16% of all deaths, which means 3 times HIV, TB, and malaria deaths combined. So if one thinks one can improve health just through medical services for patients with disease, and we neglect what we do to the environment and to air pollution and to the pollution of the sea and the water that we drink, we're deluded. We're deluded to think that healthcare all comes from that source. So now I want to say something brief about South Africa. There are many persisting and emerging challenges: deepening inequities and a growing burden of disease, poor political leadership and management capacity in the public sector, inadequate human resources and inadequate strategic plans for improving those, disconnects between policy and implementation. We seem to be capable of making policies that look good on paper, but our ability to implement those policies is weak. And there's less than adequate service delivery nationally, as you've seen from many descriptions in our newspapers. And equity is elusive. Equity is it's not there in the public sector, and it's not there in the private sector either. I did a study with some of my health policy colleagues in Canada recently, comparing the systems in Canada and in South Africa, to see why there was still inequity in a society like Canada that spends 10 times as much per capita on healthcare as South Africa. And there were several lessons that emerged from that. The first was that biomedicine and more money alone cannot abolish inequality. They can reduce them, but they cannot abolish them. The second was that the short-term and medium-term attempts to improve equity, both in Canada and in countries like ours, should focus on equitable access to insured primary health care. A national health insurance should focus on insured access to primary health care, because that's what can be afforded and that's what could be delivered. More community workers, more nurse practitioners, more midwife obstetric units. It's been shown in South Africa, for example, that the midwife obstetric units made a major difference to maternal mortality in the Western Cape. And the work of the UCT lung unit in the knowledge translation unit in rolling out the antiretroviral program is an example of what can be achieved with minimal resources and with ancillary health workers and without requiring too many physicians. And that program has been so successful that many of the provinces in this country and many countries elsewhere in the world have asked for the rollout of those programs to facilitate improvements with health. And in the long term, of course, what one needs to pay attention to are the economic and political power structures that influence health and healthcare through the various social forces that are operative at the societal level of healthcare. Now, I'm just going to say a few words about universal access to healthcare. The current global debate is that everybody should have access to healthcare. The World Health Organization is promoting the idea of universal access to healthcare. But what they're not talking about is what level this should be at. Now, 70% of the world's population live on less than $10 a day, and 40% of the world's population live on less than $3 a day. Now, at that level, you have to ask yourself, what kind of healthcare will they have access to? If you're going to go for universal access to healthcare, you'd have to define what's possible and what can be done. So the challenges for us are enormous. So for universal access to healthcare in South Africa, we have to ask ourselves what level, how to implement that, and what time frame. And this is an argument that goes back a long time. In 1945, the Gluckman Commission for a National Health Service. In the 1990s, this debate was resuscitated, and I wrote a paper in the South African Medical Journal in May of 1990 entitled A Unitary Health Service for South Africa. And more recently, a paper on healthcare disparities in our country relating specifically to NHI, and that was published in 2013, and I've looked through that again in the last few days. It remains valid today. So what do we need to do in South Africa? What we need to do in brief is to build on the strengths of the public and the private sector. We have to be able to cooperate. There must be means of generating goodwill along common professional goals for the good of the patient. And there must be principles involved in attempting to do that, but also an element of pragmatism of what can be achieved and at what pace. So what are the implications for healthcare service? What are the implications for healthcare services, medical education, and professionalism? Well, first of all, is changing disease patterns. In the wealthy world, there are major advances in medicine which are leading to personal healthcare, personalized healthcare, where it will be possible to identify the precise drugs and the precise therapies that individual patients need. This is being developed at enormous cost. And the costs mean that even in those societies with their resources, they won't be able to provide it for everybody. So inequities will arise in those societies as a result of those advances. Another problem facing societies like Canada is the aging population with multiple chronic diseases, and most of them treatable on an outpatient basis, all of them having to go to different doctors in different places and therefore no coordination of care. And it's been impossible to integrate the service because it's really a privatized service. Even though Canada has universal access to healthcare, it's a fee-for-service structure. And within that context, it's very, very difficult to integrate healthcare for an aging population with chronic diseases. And the universal healthcare system of Canada was not designed for that purpose. And then there are the ethical challenges associated with the use of artificial intelligence and robotics, which are almost certainly going to invade medicine in many ways, often for the best, but with many significant disadvantages. In poorer countries, a different set of problems. The non-communicable diseases are on the rise, the communicable diseases continue, and of course the severe injuries that arise from the trauma and the conflicts in poor countries. And all countries will face antibiotic resistance, potential for new plagues, and the mental and physical toll of conflict and mass migration and climate change. What about the threats to professionalism? What's happening to the medical profession and what's happening to other professions? Now, this is a long-standing problem. It's nothing new. And again, it's the conflict between practicing medicine as a calling, something you do because it's of social benefit, something that health professionals do because they see themselves as part of the social capital that contributes to the benefit of society. And the other side of the spectrum is where it becomes a commodity, where people are being paid fee for service. Much wonderful work done under those circumstances, but the bureaucratic systems that control the private system and the price of the commodities and the profit orientation of the pharmaceutical companies is making private practice even more difficult than it was. So there are threats at both levels. And the problem that physicians in America are facing is of burnout. It's been estimated that for every hour of time that a physician spends with patients in America, they spend 2.5 hours doing paperwork and telephone calls and electronic records, which is unremunerated and no support for that. They have to do it in between working hours. And the suicide rate in American physicians is extraordinarily high, and many of them want to quit the practice of medicine. So there's the pervasiveness of the economic bottom line and the bureaucratic and managerial imperatives that together with electronic communication, which overload practice in a very challenging manner. So what about the education of tomorrow's professionals? How will we educate people for the future, given those circumstances? Well, a few years ago, the Lancet published one of those very long papers that they publish, about 30 pages or more, on educating professionals for the 21st century. And in that paper, they emphasized the need to create and train medical professionals who will transform the societies in which they live. And they mentioned two words in that paper, but they didn't elaborate on them. Those two words were values and ethics, but they said nothing about them. So they paid lip service to those words without saying anything about them. My colleague Ross Upshur and I took that up as a challenge, and we wrote a paper suggesting that the practice of medicine, like the practice of anything else that people want to do well, was centered around the pursuit of excellence, and that the virtue of medicine was in the pursuit of excellence. And we believe that we believe today still, that sustaining and integrating essential knowledge and skills and the dispositions of health professionals for care of patients as people is what it's all about. No matter how the world changes, no matter where we are, no matter what the spectrum of disease or the challenges we have to face, individual doctors will have to be able to look after individual people. And to do that, they'll have to have a whole bunch of bedside skills and knowledge. They'll have to know the structure and the function of the human body. They'll have to be able to make a clinical diagnosis at the bedside and try to attempt to understand how far that illness has gone. They'll have to use technology astutely to confirm diagnoses instead of in a blunderbuss and wasteful fashion. They'll have to be able to prognosticate and initiate treatment, if not aimed at cure, then at least aimed at alleviation or care. And they'll have to be aware of the uncertainties and the iatrogenic effects of medical practice. There are many intellectual virtues that the professionals of the future will need to have. They'll need to have intellectual curiosity and keep up with progress. They'll have to have rigor and objectivity in their perception and their reasoning. They should have the intellectual capacity to discern and to apply relevant knowledge to clinical cases. And they should have a passionate desire for the pursuit of knowledge so that they're constantly trying to improve themselves. Virtue as excellence. And the wisdom, and the theoretical and practical wisdom to be able to apply that. I want to end with the disposition of character. What are the virtues of the character of the professional that we would all desire? And I personally have seen this in practice from the many physicians who've looked after me both here and elsewhere, and in particular those who've trained at UCT, the ability to communicate meaningfully across multiple barriers. The ability to discern the fears and the aspirations of patients and to respond appropriately, to understand the lonely nature of suffering, and to have sympathy, compassion, and empathy, all of which are different but need to be available. Physicians should be honest. They should have a level of humility, be people of integrity, fair-minded and open-minded, and have tenacity in terms of sticking to problems. Stuart Saunders will know of his colleague who pioneered liver transplantation, Tom Startzell, and how many times he failed along the way. The sociologist and medical historian Renee Fox and Judith Swayze wrote a book called The Courage to Fail. The courage to fail and to have tenacity to persist with trying to make advances. And that, of course, is what took place with the HIV/AIDS epidemic in South Africa. A great cadre of people pushed for lower-priced drugs, and their tenacity enabled them to achieve that. And so ultimately, what we need to do is to be able to apply medicine, apply the science of medicine in a humane and wise way for the care of patients. I want to sort of make that the high note of this lecture. Somehow we have to find a way of inculcating the idea of what it means to be so privileged to have the lives of other people in your hands and to care for them in the future. It's not just a job. It's more than a job. It's something that we need to be dedicated in a particular way. So let me move on to the last point briefly, some suggestions for pathways into the future. The first is to understand how we got to where we are. And I think I've given you some insight into that, not too much. There's a lot more that could go into that. That's called the diagnosis or the pathophysiology. If we don't understand how a problem has developed, we won't know what to do to treat it. And we need to know something about the pathophysiology of where we are. We also need to re-examine the quest for health. What does health mean and how do we pursue it? And we must all be willing to participate in cooperative endeavors. We have to learn to cooperate, to change hearts and minds through respective dialogue and reflective dialogue, to use freedom with responsibility, to have transdisciplinary collaboration, and to reconceive and redefine poverty in a way that protects society's weakness from the weakest from random misfortune and random misfortune. We also need a simplified and fair tax system, one which abandons the fraudulent myth about taxation, and we need to reimagine what a representative democracy means. We also need some innovative social change, and by innovative social change, I'm suggesting a shift in paradigm in the way we think. I think the single most important shift in the paradigm of thinking is to move away from a highly individualistic way of life to one which is more community-orientated and one which is not so anthropocentric but which is ecological or ecocentric, given our dependence on the environment for our future health. Now, the big question, of course, is any of this possible? Is it all pie in the sky? Is it not possible? Is it possible to do any of what I have suggested today? And I've painted a complex background for you, not because I want to be melodramatic, but because I think that those are facts that we should all know about. I do think that it's possible to make advances. First of all, through social movements that pull people together, facing in the right direction, pulling together, and deciding that it is possible to make the world a better place. Secondly, we have to expand the discourse that we have, a discourse that's not only bioethical but political and can deal with these issues at an ethical level. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And then finally, we need to stress human ingenuity. About 20 years ago, I was working on a paper entitled The Rationale for Mutual Caring. How do we care for each other across the world? And we focused on this transition of ethics from interpersonal ethics, which was what the mode was at the time, to a form of public health ethics, which arose at the time of the SARS epidemic and the HIV/AIDS epidemic, when a whole series of different ethical considerations had to be faced, to the ethics of international relationships, ecological rights, the operation of the global political economy, and the arms trade and the debt trade, and what that meant. And more recently, with a colleague, Stephen Gill, we've updated that in a paper entitled Reflections on the Political Economy of Planetary Health, published in the Review of International Political Health. So let me end with human ingenuity. Who are we? We are people that have explored outer space in the most fantastic way. We've drilled down to the Higgs boson particle. We've unraveled the genome. We've got down to understanding how the genes work and how we can manipulate diseases through designer drugs. The advances that we've made with human ingenuity at the scientific level have been spectacular. I don't believe for a moment that we don't have the ingenuity to alter the way society functions and works. It's a complex task. I think it's the sort of task that much resources should be aimed at. The MacArthur Foundation in America recently offered
a single grant of $100 million
for a research project to deal with one major global issue. And that's the kind of research project that several universities could combine to look at to see what we could do to ensure a better future for humankind. So I think that human ingenuity and human goodwill and our ability to do what we've done on a micro scale at a macro scale provides some potential for doing better in the future. I'm sorry if I've gone on a little long, and I apologize for that, but thank you very much for coming and for listening to me.
Professor Benatar, I would like to thank you very much for a most stimulating lecture. I found it very thoughtful, thought-provoking, quite sobering, and challenging. You took us through a historical and sociological review of the threats both to healthcare and professionalism. And I was grateful, as I was feeling quite depressed towards the end, that your comments on human ingenuity left us with some hope for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank all of you for attending the second Dr. Stuart John Saunders lecture. We're not going to take any questions or comments, and I would like to bring this evening to a close and to invite all of you to meet Professor Benatar in the foyer and to mingle with him after this lecture. Thank you very much.